Hello and welcome to Clay to Canopy, the show where I attempt to make just about everything from the ground up. Today we are going to be talking about sharpening your ceramic tools. I have compiled this short series of videos focused on some advanced ceramic practices to accompany a class that I'll be teaching in the spring, but I thought this information might be useful to some of y'all watching, especially my viewers who are also into ceramics, or even my sculptors who might be using some of these similar carving tools that would be used for sculptural purposes. I pulled out some of my ceramic tools, basic type of tools you'd find in a kit for carving, so we're going to go through our fettling knives, our loop tools, needle tools, hole cutters, metal ribs, and then I have some wooden ribs and a wooden stick to talk about. Rubber ribs I'm not going to get into, or any of the rubber pieces, because they're not something that's going to require sharpening. If plastic wears out, they're more likely going to need replacing. Plastic and the rubber actually wears away. And there are many things out there, from sharpening stones that come in block form and sharpening stones that come in small profiles for carving tools. However, today we're going to be using sandpaper, and sandpaper is a little bit more accessible. It also is going to be something that's going to be easier to use. Now, there's one thing you want to think about when you purchase sandpaper. It comes in two types. You can get the dry version of sandpaper, which is your typical kind that you get at the hardware store. I happen to pick up this pack from Daiso. It has multi-grits all the way up to 600, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. But this is the same kind of stuff that I use here in the studio. It's just a different brand. I usually buy 3M. I really wanted to have the ability to have up to this 600, and this was a great deal. This was $1.75 from Daiso, and this says dry sandpaper, which means that you don't use it with water, so you'll be using it just as is out of the package. Then there is something else called wet sandpaper, and this is a waterproof sandpaper that is designed to work with water. Water-based ones are usually your high grit, and they go up pretty high. Adding that water can make it a little bit smoother. It can be a better finish for metal or things that you're buffing out like fiberglass. You can use either or for the metal tools. For the wooden ones, I would recommend sticking with your dry. The wet can be a little bit messier because you're reliant on having this thing doused in water, and just because it is wet sandpaper, it doesn't mean you have to use water with it. It's just that it can be used with water. You may find at your hardware store anything higher than the 400 grit is gonna be wet dry. It's not gonna be regular. It's very rare to find this regular dry stuff that goes any higher than 220, which is part of the reason why I grabbed this when I saw it. Some of these will go up in the thousands. You can get sandpaper all the way up to 8,000 grit, and the higher you go, the more fine of a finish you're gonna get. So the higher the number, the finer the grit. 220 is usually what I use for my final finish before applying any kind of coating for furniture pieces. However, for our purposes, we're looking for a sharpened edge, and to get the sharpened edge, you would normally be using something like a sharpening stone, and my sharpening stones go up to 8,000. 8,000 finish is that super fine chisel finish, like you could shave your hair kind of finish. Now, we don't quite need that high of a finish for a ceramic tool. We do want to at least get it to where the edges are cutting again if we have dull tools that are just not doing it for us anymore. This is a staged process. You'll start with your lowest grit that you're going to take it to, and from that lowest grit you'll move up and up and up. And I have a feeling that 600 is probably going to be all we're going to need today. So the first thing you want to do though is figure out where you need to begin. For something that is super blunt, like my fettling knife here has like no edge at all, this is ridiculously blunt, then I'm going to start with a heavier grit like my 120 so that I can get some of that edge and take off as much material as fast as I can. For something like this little brass piece here, I have my tip is broken. This one I want to hit even a 60 or an 80 grit might do me. Getting a piece of this rough stuff to come in and knock that off, that's going to be the first place you go. For something like my loop tools where I don't have any nicks, but maybe my edge is not quite as dull as my fettling knife, but it's a little bit duller than I would like, then you probably can jump right in with your 220 or even your 400 and work from there. The same is going to go with your ribs. These should already be pretty sharp, and I think the only thing you're really looking for to get rid of are any nicks. Like I can see here, my tip is not quite that great. But since this metal is so thin, I would not go to the 120 with these. I'd start these off right at the 220, 240. This pack is 240. But the more aggressive you start, the more time you're gonna spend on this process, because you have to spend a certain number of time on each grit before you can move on to the next one. If you start too low, you're gonna have to be here a long time trying to keep going from grit to grit to grit. So you only wanna start where it's necessary. If I am unsure, I would rather start the higher number, see if it's actually removing what I need it to remove. And if it's not, then I can go ahead and back up a step. For the wood ones, I'm probably gonna go right ahead and start at that 120 as well. Wood can handle a little bit more. It really depends on what your goal is, how sharp you want the thing to be. Let's start off with the fettling knife. And I'm gonna start this off with some dry sandpaper. You can see my surface is jacked up here. I don't want to be working on a jacked up surface because the goal is to try and keep this as flat as possible. So I'm going to get myself a dummy piece of wood. My fettling knife has a bevel, and I'm going to be starting with that bevel. This may be an uncomfortable motion for you. It's kind of good having this board too, so I can have this handle hit at this edge, and then you're just going to sort of tip it up, try to follow that bevel, pull it towards you. You'll see the paper starting to change, and you'll see the color on the tip of your knife is going to start to change. It'll start to get fuzzy because it was originally shiny. Now it's going to start to get fuzzy as I do this. I have a lot of shine here, and then this edge is now getting fuzzy from where I'm using it against the sandpaper. You want to keep working this way until you get an even fuzziness all the way around. This is a little bit floppy. You might have to just come in and really concentrate on just the tip. You might want to tape this down. That might help. You're going to keep doing this until you get all the way down and ground down to your tip. And it might be hard to see on the camera, but when I first started, this was a pretty thick edge, and the more I sand it down, it's getting closer and closer to becoming one tip. And you'll start to see what's called a burl build up on the back. And that is where there's a little bit of extra metal that's sort of hanging at the edge. It's called a burl. So you'll see that there it develops, and that will develop once you have made it all the way to the edge. And I have got a nice burl developed along this edge, but it stops like right here. And I have this tip that's not quite there for me yet. I think we're pretty close. Alright, you want to pay special attention to what the fuzziness looks like, or the scratchy part of the edge that you put on there. Because once you switch grits, the next grit up is going to start to clear up that fuzziness, where it's going to start shining it. The goal for switching grits is going to be making sure that the whole edge looks even. So let's switch out now. I'm going to switch up to the 240. And you begin to see the fuzziness changes, and you have to keep working until you get even. I have only partial fuzziness happening, and it's starting to get shiny. I have to keep working on this one until it's all nice and even, which can take a while. Don't want to disturb the burl that's building up on the back end. You're going to leave that. We're going to deal with that at the end. And as you keep going, it's getting shinier and shinier, and all that fuzz is disappearing. Probably wouldn't need this fettling knife to go up any higher than the 240, but the higher you go, the more sharp the edge becomes. My chisels, the way to test to see if your chisels are sharp is you actually try to shave the hair off of your arms. Your razors that you use to shave hair are very, very sharp. For ceramic purposes, you don't need anything to be that sharp. Also, it's a little dangerous. You could risk cutting yourself. So I think that for our purposes, if I don't want it to be too sharp, I think I'm going to stop here. I'm not going to go any higher than the 240 on the fettling knife. Now I want to kill that burl in the back, so I'm just going to take the back edge and give it a little zhuzh up against here. And there it is. That is a nice sharp edge. Compared to what I had going on, I had like no edge at all. And that should get me there for this fettling knife. In the case of my loop tools, let's move on to those next. That edge is already a little bit sharper. So in this case, I probably will start with this 220 and then work my way higher from the 220 on. Because it's a rounded shape, there's a few ways you can do this. You can leave your paper here and then try and sort of eye where the round is and twist your way around as you're going. But you'd have to slowly, carefully be trying to twist. And in this case, we're looking to work the bevel edge. Same deal with the fettling knife, you're working the beveled edge. This is one method where you leave the thing in place. And this is why I did not show you how to do these sharpening using sharpening stones, because the sharpening stones are gonna be a long, flat surface like this. It's not gonna be as easy to deal with rounded shapes. As you can see, though this is possible, it's kind of a pain. It's not exactly the easiest way of working this. A better way to work this would be to take your paper, cut a small piece of your paper, and work it by hand. So I have just rolled up my paper, and this way I can come in and gently work my curve all around. You'll have a fuzziness that you've started with, and I don't want to do this. I don't want to come back and forth. You want to just be working in one direction, working that bevel. And you can stay on this side until you see the fuzzy that we talked about. Then you can rotate it. Even if I had to flip it this way, when I was working this way, I was pushing against the edge because I had to rotate the tool towards me to get this one. Now I'm pulling it towards the edge. It's going to take a lot longer than the fettling knife because I was able to put more pressure down, but at least it's more consistent by doing it this way than trying to do it flat like I was doing earlier. And you can switch out to the 400. This pack of sandpaper will get you there. I think the price for Daiso went up to $1.75, but $2 to rework your entire set of tools rather than having to purchase new ones. So you're going to do this for all the bevels on each side, and then of course for your square ones would be the same way to work, and the same way goes for the round one. I'm not going to sharpen each one of those in this video. Y'all don't need to be watching me do that unless you are trying to fall asleep. That would be great. I like the views. Go ahead and put it on in the background. But I'm not going to make you sit through that kind of a thing. That would be ridiculous. And then when you're done with that, now you can come in from the back side or get it at least tighter. Come in from the back side and fix your burl. And again, you're pushing only in that one direction. And that'll fix your edge. This guy has a really rough, rugged tip. So that one, I'm going to try and knock off as much of that with 60. I'm going to head and just trying to get the tip of that metal part off. Sometimes they are so bad that you need to take them over to a sander. But just remember that however far back to the grit you go, the longer you're going to be on these other stones. So I would only do it if it's really bad. In a case like this, you could also use some small files. You can get yourself a kit like this. This is pretty inexpensive. You can pick up at Harbor Freight. Pretty sure that's where I got these. They are great at working metal. This can also be a way to work out that flat. It's a little bit gentler than this 60 grit, but if all you have access to is sandpaper, then go ahead and use that. And you're just using them to get rid of that extra bit that you might have had stuck on there, and you might have to fix this part of it. So there's like a round file. You could use these files as well on these other tools if you have really bad nicks in it that you're trying to get rid of. Now, because this was roughly a 60, you'll want to go back to that 120. 120. Because this is only a slight curve, sometimes I like doing the twist motion. This is a little easier because I only have that one curve to get to, and I'm not really trying to get a beveled edge. Doing the twist thing on something like this is more than fine. And then you'll follow it up. And again, every time you switch out, you're going to have to keep moving up your sandpaper till you get to the sharpness that you're trying to achieve. And for this hole cutter, that's probably more than fine. It's gonna vary on how sharp you want that edge, depending on the tool, depending on what its purpose is. For these guys, I would not go anything down to your 220 or your 240. And this was just a matter of getting rid of that weird nick I had. And voila, my nick is gone and we're good to go. Let's go through the wooden ones as well. So in this case, I have a big nick on the tip of this wooden stick. I want to bring that back to life, so I have a tip again. If you have access to a disc sander, go ahead and take it there first. This is very similar to the same fettling knife. You have a bevel, so you want to be working within that bevel. I'm just going to use this 60 grit that I have here because that is a pretty big nick. The benefit to wood is you do not need to spend as much time on the sandpaper on each grit as you would versus the metal. Wood's soft enough that it's going to take away enough of it to not have to spend much time on each one of the grits. It went from 60. If you have an 80, you can go there, but we'll jump right into this 120. And then my 240. And that's it. Oh, get a little bit of a burl. I'm not putting as much pressure when I'm doing the back side. I'm just kind of doing a bit of a scrape, little light pressure. I'm only trying to remove the excess wood burl that's happening, not trying to do any of the back end sanding. So this direction is just really light, but this direction I'm putting more pressure. And that chip is almost completely gone. I could keep going, but that's probably more than what I need it to be. Now here we go with the wood ribs. Maybe your wood ribs have worn out over time from too much wear, too much in the bucket that you're using when you're throwing. So this guy, you can do it by hand this way on a sheet, or you might just want to refresh your wood and you can just pick up your piece and just give it a light sand all around. If you're going to be doing a lot of wooden tools and you're not in an open area, you might want to throw on a mask so you're not breathing in any sawdust. When it comes to your ribs, you want to really follow your grain. For the case of the stick, I had to go with the way the bevel was, and in this case it was cutting into a little bit of cross grain or end grain I was chopping into, which can leave a really scratchy sort of thing. You can see the grain is running in the long ways, so in order to keep it as smooth as possible, you don't want to be sanding across the grain, you want to be sanding with the grain. Otherwise, you'll make your piece really rough. Here. Now if you really have this hard bevel that you're trying to retain, then you can go ahead and go back with your larger grit sandpaper. You can see my bevel has really been thrashed. It's like really dull here, so I got my 60. Go ahead and go in with the 60. In this case I have a double-sided thing happening, so I'm going to do both sides. Didn't spend much time on that 60. I'm going to come in with my 120. Felt like this 60 was a little too rough for what I wanted and it was leaving too many scratches. That cleaned up that edge pretty quickly. Well, that's pretty nice. For the wood, I'm not going any higher than the 240 or your 220, whichever one you have. So there you have it with the dry, and just for the heck of it, let's grab some water and break out some of the wet just so you can see it in action. I cut a small piece of 220 and I have a small tray here with it soaking in some water. The reason why you don't want to use this with wood, the wet sandpaper is usually made out of an aluminum oxide and it will stain your wood. This is particularly important if you are using it for finishing. That's why you never want to use it for something that's going to be on a finished piece. Regular dry sandpaper is literally made out of sand. It's sand in different grits, so it's rock. That rock or that sand, it's not going to stain your wood the way that the aluminum oxide would, or any of the metal particulates that they use to make this sandpaper. So you do not want to be using it for your wood pieces, particularly finishing wood or furniture, that kind of thing. So let's try this, and I'll curl some of it the same way that I did the dry, and we'll take on, why don't we do the opposite edge. And you can do this submerged in the water or just dipping into the water. Some people prefer this method because it's able to take away some of that metal debris while you're working rather than it just sitting on the surface. This wet stuff is also great for fired ceramics. Works great on high fire ceramics because at that point it's pretty close to, you know, stone glass, and getting this on there, that finish, sometimes you can't quite get a smooth finish, but having the ability to wet the sandpaper will give you a better finish with your already fired pieces. Pretty much the same process, a little bit messier because you're dealing with the wet. I do think that the grit, it's a little bit smoother. So if you're using the wet stuff at 220 versus the dry at 220, you'll get a little bit more of a smoother, but that could be remedied by just going with a higher grit. You know, you do the 220 and then go with a higher one after. For the sake of these tools, do I think it matters? Probably not. You may feel like you have a least resistance because it's sort of washing it as you're going, and you might like that. You're not actually causing enough friction for the water to be necessary. If this was like attached to like a palm sander and you're sanding metal, the friction that would happen generates so much heat that the metal get too hot and start to char and burn, in which case that's why you want the wet stuff, because the water or oil, you could also use it with oil, that additive helps keep the charring from happening. But since you're doing this by hand, it really doesn't make much of a difference. So yeah, that is my take on that. Button in, I totally forgot that I did not do the needle tool. But the needle tool would be the same as any other ones. You're just gonna gently roll it around sandpaper till you get that point back. You could also do it by hand the same way that you did your loop tools. But be careful, y'all. You're making sharp tools happen once you start sharpening all these things. So don't accidentally stab yourself with your newly sharpened tools. Alright y'all, I'm going to call this video here. I hope you enjoyed hanging out with me. Please like, share, and subscribe if you have not done so already. And stick around for more ceramic tips videos.